let's get started, everyone. Welcome. And my name is Joyce Raimondo, and most of you I know. This program is being hosted by the Pollock Kranser House and Study Center. However, I'm off-site tonight. I am in my home, and that's my painting behind me. And we have a wonderful collaboration tonight between myself and our Stony Brook University intern, Savannah Ithier. And our talk is Beyond the Status Quo, Gender and Sexuality in Modern Art, with a focus on LGBTQ artists. I'm going to do a little screen share. And anyone who has come to these Zoom presentations knows that this is not a lecture. This is not a formal lecture. This is a discussion of some of the issues that are evoked with art around sexuality and gender, with a focus on LGBTQ artists. And in particular, the issues that their artworks bring up. So the name of the talk is Beyond the Status Quo. So what do we mean when we say status quo? Would anyone like to define what that means to you? You can unmute. Status quo. Well, the actual definition is status quo is the existing state of affairs, especially regarding social or political issues. So we're going to start looking at what was the status quo in regard to gender and sexuality in the time that Pollock and Kranser lived in the 30s, 40s, and 50s when they were young adults. And this is one of the iconic paintings by the famous American illustrator Norman Rockwell. It's called The Four Freedoms, and it's based on the speech by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where he outlines the four freedoms, and he even adds a new freedom, which is freedom from want. But I want to hear from you. So the first illustration up there in the upper left corner, what freedom do you think that he's speaking about in that illustration? And I don't want to do all the talking.
Speech. Freedom of speech.
Yes, very good, John. Okay, good. And the second one to the right, upper right?
Freedom of religion.
Right, good.
You can tell I'm a Rockwell fan.
Okay, yes, and this is an iconic image. How about the bottom left? I got you on that one. That's freedom from fear or security, right?
Okay.
And the bottom right is illustrating freedom from want or economic prosperity. So the reason I show you this, and we're going to look at this through the lens of the LGBTQ community. What is wrong with this picture? How do you see this? If you see it from the lens of LGBTQ, what comes to your mind during this era?
Well, it's not an era, it's an era. This was all done in the 40s and 50s, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that was the societal norms at that time.
Yeah. So if we look at what is the societal norm, right? We see the groups who are marginalized. Obviously, this is racial marginalization, right? It's gender marginalization. The women are depicted in every single picture. They're lower than the man, or they're not even in the picture at all, like in the upper left one. And it's also marginalization of queer people. So, for example, if you see the picture of the so-called ideal family, the two-parent mother and father and children in a marital situation, at that time, not only wasn't the gay two same-sex relationships, not only were they criticized or anything like that, they were illegal. They were criminalized, right? So it wasn't until actually 1962 that homosexuality became decriminalized in this country. And it wasn't until 1972 that it was no longer considered a psychiatric illness. And in 2015, same-sex marriage was legalized as a federal right. Now, when I was looking at this, I thought freedom from want, right? Freedom from want for every citizen. Well, of course, at this time, the LGBT community didn't have any rights in terms of protection under the law, right? In terms of job opportunity or even hate crimes, right? So the safety, which is depicted here, as well as financial prosperity, was threatened. And of course, freedom of speech, to me, that's also freedom of expression, the idea that every citizen should be able to express their individuality, right? And of course, in the religious picture, the religion was very punitive, the Christian religion, of homosexuality, and banned homosexuals from church. And some churches, of course, still do. So here's Jackson Pollock working during this era, and Kranser, and they're a heterosexual couple. And whenever I think of Jackson Pollock, I think of how he and Lee, actually, they broke the status quo, but not with a political message as much as with an artistic message, right? By using new tools, new techniques, but they're really championing freedom of expression. They're breaking with the old and forming a brand new way of painting called abstract expressionism. And this was very rebellious and groundbreaking. But the actual marriage between Pollock and Kranser in some ways really fit into the status quo. Kranser was supporting her husband. She gave up her career, although she continued to paint, to support him as the breadwinner, right? They didn't have children, so that was unconventional at the time. And in general, the abstract expressionist, it was a male-dominated image of what painting is. It was like a macho image, and it was promoted in magazines and the media. For example, this one in Life magazine. You could see Pollock, he looks typically masculine. He's in action doing his drip painting. He's focused. He's you know, even the way he dressed is stereotypically masculine. So at that time, the artists who were gay, they had to be closeted because they would not have been represented in the galleries had they been openly gay. So Betty Parsons, she represented Pollock after Peggy Guggenheim, and she was a lesbian, and she championed and represented many of the artists who would have been left out because of their sexual orientation. And she's also an artist in her own right, which is shown on the left. So these are two of the most famous artists that are part of the abstract expressionists: Hedda Stern, who was a lesbian, and Alfonso Sorio, who was a gay man who lived in East Hampton. And he happened to be very, very wealthy, and he also happened to be very close friends with Jackson Pollock. But these artists would have had a very hard time being represented, being openly gay. So we've divided our talk into 4 sections with different themes. These are very broad themes, so we're touching upon some of the most famous artists and bringing out some of the issues. So gender identity. I said, what do we really mean by gender identity? Well, of course, it's the way you think about yourself, the way you identify yourself according to your gender, right? So this is an example of Frida Kahlo, who happened to be bisexual. But this is a very famous painting of Frida Kahlo on the right. And she's painting a true story in her life, but she does it in a way where it's imbued with a sense of imagination. It's called Self-Portrait on the Borderline of Mexico and the United States. But the reason I chose this one is because of the way she's dressed and the way she's posed. So I want to hear from you. How would you describe Frida Kahlo in this picture? Her dress, her pose, anything that you notice?
Well, it's pink, and pink goes with femininity.
Mm-hmm. Good. Anybody else?
etiquette. She's wearing gloves.
Oh,
Her dress is covering her majority of her body.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Anyone else?
She's on a
Nicholson,
pedestal. She's on a pedestal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's on a pedestal, which sort of suggests she's sort of apart from things, right?
Right.
Anyone else? What about the type of dress that she's wearing also? In addition to it being pink.
It looks like something out of the 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
very traditional.
Yeah, very traditional. She's wearing a traditionally feminine gown. Could be from the 1800s. It's almost like a princess dress, right? So what's so interesting, and I really only recently learned this year, this is just a very good example of how we have gender constructs that become so ingrained in us that we simply take it for granted without ever realizing it's actually something that's taught. So John said pink equals femininity, right? And normally I would associate that as well. But in fact, historically, pink was for boys and blue was for girls. And that's shown in that postcard on the upper left. It wasn't only until the 1940s and 50s that pink was associated with girls and blue was associated with boys. Pink was actually thought to be a strong color, and blue was a feminine, soft color. So this sort of turns everything we've learned in this country, right, about gender and color, it just flips it on its head. Now, of course, who promotes these ideas? Well, there we have Marilyn Monroe, movies, the media, and also the commercial market. So it's very convenient if you go into a toy aisle and everything is pink is for girls, right? It helps sell the product. So in fact, these ideas that are so integral to the way we think about ourselves, human beings, and our gender, which of course links to our sexuality, is often, it's really an idea, it's a construction. Does that make sense? Now, Frida Kahlo likes to play with dualities. And so in this picture, you have half Mexico, half United States. That's a whole different discussion. Now, in this photograph, this is when she was a young woman. I think she was 17 years old, and she's in the middle. And she's wearing a traditional suit that would be worn by a man. And I looked at this and I said, we don't really have that much information about this photo. So I'd like to invite Savannah to speak a little bit about her interpretation and what she noticed about this photo, because I thought it was pretty striking. Savannah?
Yeah, it's I think it really captures the, I guess, gender identity held by Frida at the time, which really would have been seen as revolutionary. She's standing in the stark middle of the photograph and really capturing your attention. She's her posture is very strong. Clearly she's wearing a masculine suit, and something I noticed also is that it's very well fitted to her body, that, you know, this isn't just something she was playing for dress up. This is hers. She's really wearing that proudly. Her hair is obviously cropped short and she's staring directly back at the viewer. And this is really in stark contrast with like her siblings in the photo. Even her younger brother looks quite a bit shyer. But her sisters, they have this demure gaze. They, you know, they're wearing more semi-traditional dresses, but even like for the time, that would have been a little, I guess, progressive of a dress. But really looking at the difference in her stature compared to like her siblings is really striking.
Yeah. Anyone want to add to that? Any associations come to mind when you look at this photo?
Well, her arms are relaxed, whereby all of her siblings are closed. Their hands are closed, almost closed off.
Yeah, they look almost a little bit repressed, right?
Right.
And it's so interesting also, this was during the era, of course, in the 1920s, right? It's the feminist era, right? Of that time. Women cut their hair short, the hems of the skirts get higher, The waistline at the dress is now straight. They have this boyish look to them. And even so, you can see sort of the body language, like they're repressed. I'm not saying they're repressed, but it gives an image of repression. And it reminds me, actually, I was telling Savannah earlier, when my grandmother came to this country from Germany, she was a modern woman. She had a haircut like that. She was a working woman. And she married my grandfather and came to this country. And her mother-in-law made her grow her hair long and wear it in a bun. And that just always gave me the creeps. But anyway, that's another story. Just repression of women. And also this reminds me, I don't know if anyone's old enough, but in the 60s, we were not allowed to wear pants to school. And I'm really
Me
that,
too.
right?
You
And I couldn't
You
go
were
in the
sent
play-
home.
Yeah, you couldn't go in the playground. You couldn't run around. It
Right.
confines your movement as well. So here is, oh, wait a minute. Okay, this is a very famous small painting by Frida Kahlo, self-portrait with cropped hair. Now, what do you notice about this picture? How is she picturing herself here? What's the first thing that you notice?
She looks like she doesn't want to be a female anymore because she cut her hair, and she, after her terrible accident, her body was damaged so much, and I don't think she could wear nice women's clothes. And this suit reminds me of Diego Rivera.
Uh-huh.
I don't know which year this was, before
Well-
she met him or not.
Yeah, I'll give you a little background, Naomi. Frida Kahlo, because she was in the bus accident, she wore often loose-fitting clothing, but she actually wore very beautiful traditional Mexican
Oh, yeah,
clothing,
that's right.
right? The flowers, and they were adorned with embroidery and jewelry. And this picture was made 1 year after her divorce, not 1 year, shortly after her divorce from Diego Rivera. Now, she was married to the most famous Mexican muralist, a very powerful man. And he was known to be a womanizer. He had affairs constantly. And she had affairs too. In fact, sometimes she even, I think one time had an affair with one of his lovers. She was bisexual, okay? And the last straw was when he had an affair with her sister. So they got divorced, and she makes this portrait, and it says on the top in Spanish, I'm giving a rough translation. You used to love me because I have hair. Now you don't love me anymore. So any thoughts on this? Anybody else? What is she? What do you associate with this? What comes to mind?
Lover's remorse, but that's not a reason to cut your hair.
What's that, John?
It was a lover's remorse, but not a reason to cut your hair.
You think she was remorseful?
Or vengeful, or something.
Or maybe angry or vengeful. Anybody? She did in real life actually cut her hair, by the way.
She looks defiant to me because the hair is strewn all over the room. It's not just, in a pile.
Anybody else?
Well, it looks like she's kind of making a statement about her bisexuality on some level there.
And what do you mean by that? What do you imagine? I mean, we're speculating based on our own thoughts. So can you go further with that, Lisa?
Well, just because she looks very masculine here. I
And
don't
what
know.
about her looks masculine? What about her looks
What-
masculine specifically?
Well, besides her hair and her clothes, I don't know. I guess I can't really zoom in on her face, but she looks pretty confident to me on some level. I don't know.
And we associate confidence with masculinity. It's a gender
Maybe.
construct, right?
Maybe, well, that's just what came to my mind here.
Uh-huh. And look
I
at
think-
the way she's sitting, right, Lisa?
I
She's
think we
sitting
all
like
have
a-
masculine and feminine in us,
Mhm.
obviously, and we need that balance. But here she's coming more forthright with her more assertive energy, maybe.
Mhm.
It's that way to me.
Anyone
Well,
else? Savannah, do you have anything to say about this one?
Yeah, I mean the way that she's sitting on that chair is just really powerful and traditionally masculine. But I think there's something to be said even about her keeping an earring in her ear and kind of reclaiming that power herself, and also that with the red shirt and the red flooring. But really keeping like a little part of that femininity, and even though she's really reclaiming that her power and really gazing right back at the viewer and commanding that energy, it's not entirely making her masculine. She's kind of just making herself.
Yeah, she gives us
Defiant.
of her femininity. Even her feet are very dainty. Her hands are dainty. Not that I'm not saying all women have dainty hands, but I'm saying it's more of a traditional way of thinking about femininity, especially in her day.
Also, notice the way the feet are splayed. They're
What
not,
about
they're not parallel. They're not, the legs aren't crossed. It's more of a, it's a defiant pose.
Yeah, well, the one knee is sort of sticking right out, right? And
Right.
her face also, she's looking straight out at us. And often in Frida Kahlo, again, it's this duality, feminine and masculine. And often she'll have this defiance and strength in her artwork that comes through, even in some of her pictures where she's extremely vulnerable. This picture, this is why this is great art. We could talk about this for hours. To me, I associate so much with this picture. Being a woman myself, I associate the idea, if you don't love me, if I don't look a certain way, you're not going to love me anymore, right? Wanting people's approval. And then going beyond that to find my own voice, right? And then, growing up coming to age in the late 70s and 80s, where women were expected to have masculine traits in order to succeed in business, right? Some women in the corporate world even lowered their voices, or they dressed more like masculine because they didn't want to be associated with femininity. It would seem like weakness. All of these things. This is why it's a great painting. And then it could also do with just gender sexuality as well, right? So this is not clear. This painting, Frida Kahlo gave it to her lover, but it's not clear, her female lover, if it's a portrait of the two of them or if it's just two aspects of Frida Kahlo. So she was half European on the father's side and half indigenous Mexican on the mother's side. So it's ambiguous in that way. Any thoughts on this one? If you look at these two women or the setting, what comes to mind? Anything?
Look at the vines in the on the left-hand side. Vines are entwined,
Like maybe it's
like these two people are.
very good, John. Yeah, maybe it's a metaphor. Anyone else?
It's
I think-
interesting how you see the roots on the bottom too. She really made a point of like drawing in all those roots. Like, I don't know, just nature.
Yeah.
She's depicting nature, some sort of earth mother, earth symbols.
Yeah, well, she originally called it the Earth itself, and then she changed the name. The name of the girlfriend, by the way, was the Mexican movie star Dolores Del Rio. Anyone else notice anything about the two figures or anything else?
What is that? That's sort of not center, but it's center left. It's a sort of like a something it's underneath where the knot is, underneath the
monkey.
it is blurry on my side.
Oh, no, it's a monkey, John.
Okay, so it's the only thing that stands out. What is it? Okay, we know but what does it represent?
Well, Frida Kahlo did have two pet monkeys that were like her children because she was unable to have children. And the monkey and that side sort of, to me, it reminds me of, it's the wild, right? It's a wild animal, a monkey, normally, right? In her case, she had them as pets.
I
Is it
think
what-
the,
Yeah, go ahead.
I think I'm looking at the shroud, the red shroud,
Mhm.
and it looks to be like, you know, just the power of nature and the power of women in nature and the power of death and life and just the representation of that red and blood and
Mhm.
power and
Mhm.
birth and death and, you know, all encompassing really,
Mhm.
and that we are nature, and very powerful like nature, the
Mhm.
nature that we are. It's very powerful
Mhm.
painting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone else? And also, I love the way the seated woman is sort of holding the other woman who seems to be more vulnerable
Yeah.
and almost consoling her. And because Frida Kahlo had so much pain, I also wonder if she's imagining just this sort of comforting, nurturing force, right?
Right.
And so I always think it's really interesting. This is just my own personal feeling. You know, when women are nurturing and women are certainly fierce and strong, that's obvious. No, I'm just kidding. And but the nurturing really part of women, sometimes it sort of gets undermined, like as if it's a weakness. And it certainly isn't. It's a strength,
No.
right?
Mhm.
Oh, so, wait a minute. Okay. Okay, so fast forward. This is Harmony Hammond. This is the feminist art era in the 70s. Okay, so what Harmony Hammond did, she's a leader of the feminist art movement, and she's also an art writer and an independent curator. And the feminist art movement basically challenges ideas about gender, sexuality, and even the way art was made, the materials themselves. And so within this group, there's the lesbian feminist artist who Harmony Hammond happened to be one. So what she did here is she took clothing, she got it from her friends or her own clothing, and it was like polka dots, stripes, different patterns, plaids. She tore it into strips and then painted it by dipping it into liquid paint, and then sewed it and stitched it together and tied it together to create these hanging sculptures, which becomes an installation and you can walk around it. And it's called Presence. Now, any thoughts on this one? A little more challenging, right? Now, there's a few things. One is she's actually challenging the artistic material that is typically used to make sculpture. Sculpture we usually think of as something like steel, or even Calder is using wire, but still it's something it's more masculine, it's a harder material. Feminist artists start to use what's traditionally associated with women, right? Like fabric and sewing, and they use that in, some of them use it in their art. And she's also literally, we were talking about clothing in Frida Kahlo and how this forms our gender identity. She's literally deconstructing the clothing. She's tearing it up, right? And she's recreating it to make an art that gives you pause for contemplation. She says that that she wanted to also showcase the idea that women take up space, and in particularly lesbian women take up space. Not that this piece in particular, there's nothing in it in particular that would signal that idea. Anyone want to speak about this, what it makes you think of?
All pieces, the rags and all the different pieces remind me of all the different people we meet and situations we're in life, how that makes us who we are. I mean, it informs us.
Yeah. And here she sort of combined all this clothing from different friends. Mhm. Anyone else?
I think it's kind of interesting that these forms are hanging there, like they don't have any heads or any kind of personality. They're just like strips of clothing, like, and, you know, I mean, it also could be somewhat a comment on the fashion industry, you
Mhm.
know, and what it does to women in terms of, uh, you know, stereotyping them. I don't
Yeah.
know.
No,
Just
that's
my
for
idea.
sure. I mean, that's a whole other topic, right? I
Yeah.
mean, that's for sure, like stereotyping and also, uh, you know, the way women feel they have to conform to those stereotypes in order to fit in order to be loved, right? In
You
some,
know, it's just they're just like pretty strips hanging there, but there's no head, there's no, I don't know, personality.
yeah. To me, they also have a ghostly quality to them, right?
Yes, definitely.
No shape to them.
Mhm. Yeah. These remind me also, and I hope you don't mind my own personal stories here and there, but I'll never forget when I was in graduate school and I started working with strips of fabric and other very fragile materials. And my teachers, my male teacher said, this is ridiculous, you know, this is just silly. And like, you should make it out of steel, metal. So I figured, okay. So I went, I got steel and cutters. It was, I was like, I don't want to work steel. Like, I don't want to do this. And I realized
Yeah.
that was just a complete bias. It was a gender bias in the education system, right? Of what
Mhm.
materials are acceptable. But there's many artists in this era who work with fabric. But the feminist artists of the 1970s, which is beyond the scope of this talk, many of the women, some lesbian, some heterosexual, some bisexual, they really also work with sexual imagery and their own sexuality in art, okay, as well as this idea of these materials that are traditionally seen as feminine, incorporating that back into work, incorporating craft back into high art, okay? So Harmony Hammond, in addition to the art, she created in 1976, excuse me, was the first publication of this magazine Heresies, which was a feminist publication on art and politics. In 1972, she co-founded AIR Gallery, the first women's cooperative in New York City. Why did she have to do that? Because women were not shown in galleries, right? And she says, lesbian erasure is not acceptable. We have no choice but to be vigilant. So I don't know if I already told this story, but I was a little shocked when I found out that the Kinsey report in the 1940s, the groundbreaking report on sexuality in America, included studies about gay men, and they completely left out gay women until the 1950s. So literally, it was like just an experience of being a human being that's not represented or even thought of to be an experience by the larger dominant culture. Now, Savannah, will you tell us a little bit about the image on the left, which is not by Harmony Hammond? But will you tell us who it's by and a little bit about why you chose that one?
Yeah, so this photograph is by Catherine Opie, who is also a lesbian photographer. Harmony Hammond had created a book called Lesbian Art in America, and it documented the work of lesbian artists from the 1970s through, I think it went through the mid-90s. And this was one of the cover photos. And I thought that it was really striking as just a lesbian photograph. And it really captures like femininity and beauty, but also strength and like the musculature of her back. Also, I really like the point that you had made earlier, Joyce, in the discussion of like vulnerability, and kind of like being proud almost of that vulnerability. But most prominent is the tattoo on the back of this woman's neck that does say dyke, which is a slur against lesbian individuals. But often lesbian individuals do kind of reclaim that for like an aspect of their identity. And this individual is proudly wearing it. And I thought that was just really striking.
I can't read that. Is that what it says, Dyke there? It looks
Yeah.
like, okay.
Yes. Mhm. Anyone else want to comment on this image? To me, it really, I don't know, I feel a little bit like there's a little, it's so beautiful, and at the same time, it's like a target on her back. It's like she's really vulnerable in that way, you know? I might look at it tomorrow and see it differently. That's why it's great art. We cannot nail it down, right?
Mhm.
And we can relate to these things in so many ways. Vulnerability and strength, it's the human experience, right?
Mhm.
Now this is Nan Golden, and Nan is a photographer. And let me just make this a little smaller. Nan Golden photographs what we would call like the subcultures, right, in the 70s and 80s. So, and mainly LGBTQ subcultures and in New York City. So she has a very famous project called The Ballad of Sexual Dependency, where she documents the gay subculture in New York and also like the opioid drug addicted culture. And then she does this other project called The Other Side. And I just really love this quote. She documents the drag community in their performances. And she says, the pictures in this book are not of people suffering gender dysphoria, but rather expressing gender euphoria. The people in these pictures are truly revolutionary. They are the real winners in the battle of the sexes because they have stepped out of the ring. And I recently saw a documentary on Netflix, and it was about, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the name. It was about the depiction really of transgender or drag in film, and how the character is usually shown in a very derogatory way, the brunt of jokes, as a drug addict, a prostitute being killed. And it really goes over the effect that this had on people who were transgender as they saw these films when they grew up. So I just love this celebration of Nan Golden. And I recall seeing these photographs in the 80s when I lived in New York. And I just thought they were so interesting that everyone has a right to be represented, right?
Mhm.
And this is one that I made. And
Ooh.
it's a small painting, it's 9 by 12. And I call this my prayer painting series. So I make, during the pandemic, I would make small paintings for people that I would think about like what really gives them joy and make a painting of that image. So this was made for my nephew, Timmy, who discovered his love of drag. And within a very short time, he became very adept at the artistry of makeup, and his creativity was just flourishing. He started to sew dresses, and I was just so proud of him. He also wound up within a very short time performing at the iconic bar Stonewall in New York City. And I wanted to encourage him. And so I made him this painting, and on the back it says, go confidently in the direction of your dreams, live the life you've always imagined. And that's Henry David Thoreau. So this is the spirit of this talk. I'm doing this talk in a spirit of love because I feel a conviction, whether it's this talk or any talk actually, that people are entitled to have a true, authentic voice in art or in life in general. People are entitled to follow their truth. Not everybody has to like it. I get that. Okay, so This is our next section, intimacy and desire. So very broad topic. I'm starting with this one, which these are heterosexual images. And the reason I'm starting with this is because when we look at these images of intimacy or sexuality, when these kind of heterosexual images done by heterosexual men, white men in particular, are in museums, we don't really give it much of a thought. When I worked at the Museum of Modern Art in the 90s, we had the Picasso's, not this particular one, but another miniature tour image there, and would walk by that. And then we had a retrospective of Egon Schiele with many, many images of prostitutes who were, you know, they were very explicit images. This one, the embrace, happens to be of him and his wife. But when it comes to the gay experience, right, such as Andy Warhol, these sorts of images were not represented in museums because it is not showing a heterosexual view. They were also not accepted in the gallery scene in the 1950s. It was only until 1956 he did have a solo exhibition of these at the Boldly Gallery. But what's interesting also, when we think of Andy Warhol, we think of Campbell's soup cans. We think of these pop art images of celebrities that are actually very kind of cold, right? They're drawn from the media, and they're not imbued really with a lot of feeling. This is another side of Andy Warhol. These drawings are very intimate of him and his lovers, and they're also kind of funny. Some of them are lyrical, right? Like the one on the left. It's a little funny, right? And Andy Warhol's creativity is so broad and so vast. So he also makes films, and these films are very challenging in that they're in real time. Most films, you can have 10 years pass by in 10 minutes. Andy Warhol just films his lover sleeping. And so they're very voyeuristic and intimate, and yet kind of ironically, they're also really boring. So he has one film where his lover seems to be experienced this, the face looks like there's some kind of erotic thing going on. It's just a close-up of his face. And it just goes on. And even though it's about eroticism, it's actually kind of deadpan and boring. And Andy Warhol, even though a lot of his work deals with sexuality, he himself, when asked, he has a famous quote where he said something like, "Sex is not important to me." But he certainly explored sex and sexuality in his work. In the 80s, he made these screen prints of many, many celebrities. Here on the left, this is Keith Haring with his lover. They were friends. Andy Warhol and Keith Haring, the famous artist. And on the right is an image called Torso. And Andy Warhol did a whole series of screen prints called Torso and another series called Sex Parts. And these are very, very sexually explicit images. So if you're interested, you can look them up. I chose not to show them in this talk, okay? Of course, we've probably heard of the Factory, where Andy Warhol has this space in Manhattan, and he hosts these parties, and it's the 1960s, right? This is a complete reaction to the rigidity of the 50s, which we were discussing with Norman Rockwell. Andy Warhol says anything goes at these parties. He has all sorts of films being filmed, being screened, drugs, sex, rock and roll, so to speak, drag queens, the famous drag queen Divine, another one, Candy, all sorts of happenings going on at the Factory, as well as the creation of art in a collaborative way. So here next up is Robert Mapplethorpe. And this is one of his beautiful photographs. Robert Mapplethorpe was raised in the suburbs, moves to New York City. His friend gives him a camera. He was in art school, and he becomes just a master photography. His photographs actually were the highest selling photographs in the 1980s. I think one sold for $200,000, which had previously been unheard of. But he's breaking new ground. Talk about going past the status quo. So what's going on here? What do we see here that's sort of going beyond the status quo? Anything?
Well, it's two men and it's black and white.
And they're in this very tender, loving embrace.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, as we said, homosexuality was criminalized up until 1962, and then it was state to state. And also the right to marry outside of your race was also criminalized. I don't remember the year that ended. Maybe somebody else knows and can tell us. I have it in my notes and I just lost it. So yes, and he's showing this tender embrace. Now, if you were alive during the 1980s, you probably remember this. Mapplethorpe becomes the center of controversy. So the Cincinnati Contemporary Art Museum puts together a traveling show of Mapplethorpe's photographs. There's 3 portfolios. One has flowers and still lifes that are spectacular. One has nudes, and one has S&M photos of S&M subculture in New York City, as well as there were 2 photos in the exhibit of 2 nude children. So there's these 3 portfolios. And as this exhibit is traveling, it becomes the center of controversy, and the museums who are showing this work, their funding is threatened because it was funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. So when the exhibit is about to be shown in Cincinnati, it was actually the sheriff goes to the museum, and they were actually brought up on criminal charges of obscenity, not because of these photos, but because of the 5 S&M photos, as well as 2 nude photos of children. Okay, now, by the way, the photos of children, the parents gave consent, and they were like benign photos of children who happened to be nude. There was nothing sexual about the children. Okay, now, what happens is this goes to trial. They would not allow the whole entire body of Mapplethorpe's work to be shown. They could only show those 7 photos. And of course, the lawyers get to choose the jury. And as it turns out, the museum won the case on the basis of the First Amendment, that art doesn't have to be pretty. You don't have to come to the museum. And the jury seemed to be annoyed that only 7 pictures went to court rather than the whole body of work. And also the lawyers emphasized the artistic value in the work. In other words, that this was not designed to titillate, it's not pornography. These are master photographs, okay? So if you want to see the photos, you can find them online. And of course, this historic photo shows the protesters on the conservative side and the so-called liberal side, would both have their point of view about this issue. Now, today, of course, who would like to bring this up to date? What's going on today when we talk of freedom of expression and the LGBTQ community? Anything come to mind? Any issues going on as we speak?
The only thing I can throw in is, this is 2022. What's the big deal? But then again, I've evolved. And that's what this is all about, is evolvement.
We are evolving, John. And today we say, what's the big deal? And, you know, very good point. What's status quo? And then what sort of pushes through or against the status quo? Usually there's a backlash, but then eventually it becomes status quo in a way. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Society, yes, society
Yeah.
balances both sides, and whatever side society wants is the winner, quote unquote.
well, and there's also a lot of complex issues in that, because of course, a lot of times it has to do with money is power. So let's say in the case of that Mapplethorpe case, for example, they threatened to pull funding. So that, of course, is going to coerce museums, right? And they also threatened to pull money from some of the companies that gave money to the museums. Okay, so these are very complex issues that go beyond the scope of this talk. So Robert Mapplethorpe, sadly, he dies of AIDS in the 1980s. And our next section, we're going to talk about that in a little more detail. And he establishes the Robert Mapplethorpe Foundation in 1988 to promote photography, support museums that exhibit photographic art, and to fund medical research in the fight against HIV and AIDS. So beyond the scope of his art, this is his legacy.
Well, I wanted to share with everybody that there's a great photography museum in Manhattan on Park Avenue and 22nd Street. It's a Swedish name, photography. I forget the exact name of it, but it's on 22nd and Park. And I saw a big retrospect there of a Mapplethorpe last year, but it is a beautiful building and it's all photography.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. I see we're approaching the hour, so we're going to run over in this talk, but it's fine with me. I hope you're enjoying the discussion. So our next section is art and activism. Obviously, this is a very broad and deep topic. So we're going to focus on just a couple of artists here. So Savannah, will you tell us about this artist who you chose?
Yes. So this is an installation sculpture by Felix Gonzalez Torres. So it was created in 1991 following the death of his lover by AIDS complications. The sculpture itself is composed of multicolored candies, which highlights the personality and sweetness of Gonzalez Torres's lover, but also his bright personality, which was lost. But the sculpture itself, at its beginning, it's 175 pounds, which was his partner's starting weight before he started to deteriorate from AIDS complications. And the intent of the sculpture is for the viewer to take a piece of candy as they visit the piece and to leave with it. And the thought behind that is the complicity of the public during the AIDS crisis in mostly in New York City is a really big one, but in the States in general, and the gay and bisexual male community, in that as you're taking these candies, the weight of the sculpture is becoming smaller and smaller, and the viewer has a huge part in that. Similarly, like I said, to the public's ignorance of the AIDS crisis.
Thank you, Savannah. When I looked at this also, and we've talked about this in our other Zoom talks, I noticed it's a formation of a triangle or a pyramid. And two things came to mind. One is typically the pyramid is associated with ascension, like the Egyptian pyramid, it's reaching towards the heavens. Or even the Catholic symbol of the trilogy. You find this in many, many religions, or even the Star of David. And also, it happens to be the symbol for ACT UP, which is that little triangle down there. So this is a work by Keith Haring. So what's going on here? What do you notice about these figures? What do they represent?
The famous monkeys, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. And people, I guess during that time, not wanting to hear or see or talk about it. And even he says on the bottom, silence equal death. So
yeah, well, this is a poster. So Keith Haring, he's known for his subway drawings and his murals. And he also in general is known for this idea. He wanted art to be for the people. So he wanted art to be outside the walls of the museum. And in this particular case, silence literally equaled death. And it was just one of the most horrible, tragic, cruel things to do to human beings, which is really ignore this epidemic, the AIDS epidemic that's ravaging through the gay community, and the government largely ignoring it because they stigmatized it and didn't do the adequate research and didn't respond to it in a timely way. And then on top of that, really stigmatizing and almost blaming people for the disease, right? Like, oh, well, you got that because you're gay. You got that because you use needles. You're a drug addict. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, they used to call it the gay plague
The gay
You know,
plague, yeah.
in the beginning,
Yeah.
anyway.
So it's really, in my opinion, cruel, as well as, of course, the devastating loss of human life. So how do artists respond to this? Keith Haring is a wonderful, he's a fine artist, but it crosses also over into graphic communication. So here he's encouraging people, fight AIDS, act up in a way that's very easy for somebody to understand. And here are some of his other images. The Heritage of Pride, which he made for the Gay Pride Parade or Pride Month, and the National Coming Out Day on the left. Now, these things to us now might be like, oh, well, whatever. We have, Pride has become more of an accepted part of our society, right? But even at that time in the 1980s, it was very frightening for people to come out of the closet. And obviously in some parts, or for some people, it still is, but we've come a long way. And like Mapplethorpe, Keith Haring leaves us with this wonderful foundation. He died when he was young in 1989. The year before he died, he established the Keith Haring Foundation, which perpetuates his legacy through the circulation of his artwork, archives, and providing grants to children in need and those affected by the HIV/AIDS virus. He did a wonderful mural with like 900 children downtown, and you could still see some of his murals in New York City. He also had the Pop Shop, which is now online. It used to be a physical building. So on that note of AIDS and activism, we felt it was really important to include one of the most important historic events in this country, which is the Stonewall riots and the activism that followed that. Savannah, you want to tell us a little bit about these images?
Yeah. So the image on the bottom left is really the only known photograph from the night of the Stonewall riots. So Stonewall was a gay bar in Greenwich Village, and it was frequent to police riots, but it didn't normally get super out of hand. On this particular night, they had taken a couple of trans women and arrested them for portraying their gender expression. And these women fought back. One of these women that started this procession of like fighting back against the police, arresting them for just expressing themselves, was Marsha P. Johnson. And she sorry she was really an integral part of really the fight against discrimination on that particular day, and just in like New York City at the time. She was also a huge part of the like ACT UP corporation, and really fought back against like the AIDS crisis as well. The top image was from 2021. It is a statue of her, and visitors are encouraged to leave flowers on the statue. And that's in Christopher Park, right across the street from where the Stonewall Inn still stands. And she had also sat at one point for Andy Warhol for a portrait of her.
Thank you, Savannah. I think it's really interesting when I learned about this statue, how we have statues of people who are leaders in civil rights. And I love this. It's really inclusive of what does it mean to have civil rights. And this, of course, shows the first gay pride parade, which was in New York City, and then it also events were held across the country. And at that time, it had a different name. It was called the Christopher Street Liberation Day. And out of the Stonewall event and the riots and the parade and so on grew. I forget the name of it now. Hold on. It was the Gay Liberation Front, which was later the Gay Activist Alliance. So I am so thrilled that Savannah is going to lead this discussion of, I think it's 3 or 4 artists who are contemporary artists who have contemporary visions and bring this up to date. And Savannah has just jumped in. She has been doing this internship for approximately 2 weeks. So thank you, Savannah.
Of course, thank you. So the first artist I wanted to highlight is Kehinde Wiley. He is a gay man. He's from Brooklyn, and he, in his paintings, he takes what is traditionally a white and male-dominated portrayal, especially in like classicism and like Renaissance paintings, and he replaces them with like Black forms. In this particular series that he did, it's called Passing Posing, and in it he highlighted the Black queer community in New York City, and really the steps that they would often have to take to pass in society. So these two in particular, really highlighting like Christian iconography, and placing the models that he had in the traditional poses of like various saints and prophets, that again would have otherwise been portrayed by like a cis straight white individual. So in the one on the left, it's a photograph of, or a painting of his model as Saint Sebastian. And Saint Sebastian in particular was often used to highlight the male form in unconventional ways. And specifically in doing research on Saint Sebastian, like for this, often kind of discuss like an almost homoerotic and pleasurable subtext. So to choose Saint Sebastian as for this individual was just really interesting. Saint Sebastian often would have been shown pierced with arrows, and instead this individual is pierced with tattoos and really showing their own individuality. The figure on the right is discussing the prophet Deborah, which obviously is like kind of discussing an almost gender ambiguity, while this figure is still in modern clothing and passing as like a modern, standard typical Black male. Just the paintings are really highlighting the beauty of these individuals, and Kendall Wiley makes a point of taking them out of like a space where they would otherwise fall into the background, and he places these just kind of ornate designs behind them so that they really are the focus. They are kind of floating in their own world, and they can come to the forefront exactly how they wanted to be seen. And I don't know if Joyce, you have anything to add to that, or?
Well, I love the way, just in terms of just visually, how you have sort of this ephemeral imagery of the design, the patterns, and then you have like sort of this massive form that it's like this contrast.
Mhm.
And then I think it also reminded me when I saw the image of the left of sort of like the way the male is depicted in advertising, like with the underwear and the fashion and the whole fashion trend of like, you know, male's fashion. We discuss women's fashion, but the same goes for men as well. And then also it reminded me a little bit of like the way we sexualize people too sometimes, like the one on the left. It's ambiguous. That's why
Yeah.
it's a good piece of art. Anybody else on any of these?
Kendall Wiley was the first gay Black man to be commissioned for a presidential portrait, which is just really incredible, and he's an amazing portraiture. But I just wanted to show the painting of Obama because it's absolutely stunning, and it really captures both like traditional masculinity and power, but it also really captures his softness. And it's interesting that like greens around him are almost like closing in and gripping him, and it's just a really active portrait. Something really interesting too is that it kind of reminds me of the Frida Kahlo portrait of just her really commanding stance sitting on that chair. Just comparing the two is really interesting.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Any other comments on this one from anyone out there?
Where is this painting? Is it in the museum now?
It was on tour. I'm not sure if it's right now in a museum. I did see it more recently at the Whitney, but that was about almost a year ago at this point. I should have found that. I'm so sorry.
No, it's amazing.
No,
Yeah.
it is amazing.
It's very inspirational.
Yeah. I just love like the soft colors and like the duality of like femininity and masculinity just expressed in the portrait. Anything else, or do you want to move on to the
I
next?
think we could go to the next one.
Okay. So this is Anele Maholi. They are a non-binary artist from South Africa, and their photography really uplifts the LGBTQ community in South Africa, and the expression of both gender and sexuality of those individuals, you know, in ways that they otherwise might not be able to define themselves. So the image on the left is of a trans woman, and Maholi brought her to a beach in South Africa that was near Maholi's hometown. And this individual is wearing a really beautiful dress. She's wearing really powerful red shoes. But most importantly, she's placed on a beach in an area that might not otherwise be super welcoming to queer individuals. And she's allowed to be herself fully in this moment, just in the serenity of the beach. And I thought that was really beautiful. And the figure on the right is a trans man, and Moholy has captured him in this moment where he's kind of, preparing himself to go about his day, but kind of highlighting like a behind the scenes moment, and just really capturing like just the beauty of this individual.
So when you say this is a trans man, that is a woman dressing up and hiding her breast.
Lisa, that's a very good question. So Savannah, do you think can you like sort of succinctly explain the terminology when we say man, woman, and trans, and what there are certain, how can I say, guidelines now of the way the kind of language a person is expected to use. So can you go over that a little bit?
Yeah, so a trans man would be someone who was assigned female at birth and who is their gender expression is male. So some people don't fully go through like surgeries, but they're actively becoming a man in their everyday life, or they are portraying that to the best of their abilities, to what feels right for them. And on the other side, like with the figure on the left, that is an individual who was born a man, but identifies as a woman.
And it can be a little confusing, Lisa, but basically some trans people, they don't go by the sex that individual was assigned at birth.
Right.
They go by the sex that they identify with, the gender they identify with. So they don't say I was a woman and now I'm a man. The person would say I was a man then and I'm a man now, and I was sort of assigned the wrong gender. Does that make sense? Is that correct, Savannah?
Yeah, I think that describes it well.
Well, I know that there's transvestites and there's transsexuals. Like I went to a cabaret show, and these guys, I didn't know whether they identified themselves as a man or whether and like what did they do with their genitals. It's just a little bit confusing. Some people told me that they just tuck them under, and they actually can be straight, but they perform transsexually. So there's like different variations of what's going on here.
Yeah, and also, Lisa,
the trans world.
Yeah, the terms change. So let's say people used to say transvestite, now they don't say that anymore. It's sort of outside the scope of the talk to explain, because we could probably talk about the terminology for like at least an hour or two. Savannah, what are your thoughts on that in a nutshell?
Yeah, the terms transvestite and transsexual are definitely outdated. And I guess one comment I wanted to make is that not all trans individuals are the same and express their gender in the same way. So some people, might find their breasts like that individual, and some individuals might not. But it's really up to them to determine their gender. It's not something that's so easily that you can so easily determine from the outside. But there's a lot of really great literature out there that really helps to define like modern terminology surrounding transgender individuals, and even like the kind of space between masculine and feminine, and like the idea of like non-binary individuals, or some people who might perform drag and that enjoy dressing up as another gender without identifying as such. So there's really a lot of really great literature out there on that.
Yeah. Lisa, I really appreciate your question, because this is why I love art, because we're looking at art, so it raises these questions and it raises our awareness, right? It's just a little, it's, the subject is a little too broad to kind of discuss.
Yeah, and I also, what I
But your
just got,
questions are very well taken, so.
and also it's individual, it's a little bit individually interpreted, you know, how somebody becomes a trans, who they are. It's not just that they all go through the same process
No, not at all.
emotionally and physically, you know.
Mhm.
But it is interesting. You know, what also has happened in that it used to be, not talking about trans as much as gay people. Now it's queer. Now that's accepted more than being gay. I've heard like people wanting to be called queer.
Yeah, we're around the same age, and so
So
when we
queer
grew up,
wasn't,
yeah, when we grew up, that was derogatory.
it was.
But now, you want to speak to that a little bit, Savannah? The term?
Sure. Yeah, so it's a term that has been reclaimed by the LGBT plus community to kind of, so calling it the gay community eliminates the identities of bisexual individuals and lesbian individuals and transgender individuals and intersex, etc. And sometimes it's referred to as the LGBTQ plus community, but really in reclaiming queer, it's a way to encompass all of that community in one term.
Right.
Thank you, Savannah. Savannah, do
guess.
you happen to know of a website offhand that you would recommend to explain these terms in sort of a non-academic way that a layman could understand?
I know there's like the LGBT network, I think is a New York based company, and I know that they have, I mean, they have quite a few programs for LGBT individuals, but I would assume that they would have some definitions and resources even on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, should we go to the next one?
Sure. These two photographs are also by Zanelli Maholi, and they're highlighting the lesbian community in South Africa, and really capturing these individuals at just various sensual moments and really highlighting like the beauty of queer love. And yeah, I love these photographs so much. So I really was excited to include them. They're really gorgeous. But I just love like the one on the left really highlights the softness of both of these women, and the one on the right is really interesting in the way that both of these women are so happy and they're gazing straight back at the viewer as if almost to say like, so what? Like they're really taking their identity and almost like just commenting on like the openness of their love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've talked about in other talks that I give for the Pollock House, the way a visual artist can convey other senses.
Mhm.
And to me, this one really conveys a sense of touch and softness, a tactile sense.
Yeah.
It also strangely reminds me of Picasso because the way the two figures almost become one in a
Mhm.
way, like Picasso's faces. And
Yeah.
even the couple on the right, the way they become entwined almost like one. Any thoughts on these photographs? Any reactions?
I like the black and white and all the shadows and the sort of glistening effect of their skin.
Mhm.
It looks like a real connection that they're making in both photographs, a very intimate connection that comes through.
Mhm.
Yeah. It has a very loving feeling towards it. I wonder why. I'm not, maybe just the expression on the face.
Well, yeah, and I mean it's like embracing and it's kissing, so that's like it's just very simple and direct in a way.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is a really great way to like capture the emotions in it. And something else that I always think about when I like look at these images is how starkly different they are from images of women in other like straight male photography or even in like paintings, as we saw before, which generally usually highlight the like sexuality of women and like the possession of that sexuality of women. And like these photographs really just highlight the softness and romance behind these individuals rather than an explicit sexuality.
Mhm. Also, it's speaking about women's sexuality, in this case, lesbian women, but really women's sexuality from the viewpoint of a woman was really neglected for many years. It really only came about in the feminist movement in the 70s, and an artist like Alice Neal, who had some intimate portraits, those really weren't well known, you know. It was all from the heterosexual male experience.
Yeah.
And this is our final image.
So this is a painting by Christina Karls. She is also a lesbian artist. And she works kind of in this like abstract abstract form, which I thought kind of pertained to the Pollock house and just really gave a lot of like interesting thoughts behind the paintings. But to me, this image kind of evokes like a lot of different meanings, but it can capture kind of the soft love between these women, but it's a little ambiguous in the way that it describes potentially like mourning of like the loss of potentially a romantic partner, or potentially they're embracing and they're in a partnership. And there's a lot of different meanings that you could attach to this painting, which I thought just was really interesting. I'm not sure if anybody has any thoughts about it.
Anyone notice if this is also, it's abstract, but it also has like a narrative quality to it. It has like a storytelling quality. What gets me is that claw,
Yeah.
that hand that looks like a claw. And I'm wondering, is she losing this lover? Is she grasping onto a memory? Or it's just so disturbing, that hand. The whole picture looks sort of a little soft, but then you have that like claw-like hand. It's a grasping.
Yeah.
I don't know, anybody else on this one? Maybe somebody who hasn't said anything yet? Questions? Well, our last image is the flag, which has evolved from the rainbow flag to a more inclusive flag, including transgender. And is this also a flag? Can you actually, we didn't really go over this, Savannah, but how has this flag exactly been updated? Do you know?
So the most recent iteration that I've seen, it includes a like a yellow circle in this kind of diamond pattern, and that's to include intersex individuals to the community. But the flag has changed quite a bit over the years, and it used to just be a rainbow flag. But in addition to the like the pale blue, the pink, and the white, which encompass the trans community, the black and the brown, I'm not 100% sure exactly what those indicate, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, I decided to put this in here to end on this because, you know, Pride in some ways it's become commercialized. You can go into any store and get, you know, a Love is Love shirt or a rainbow shirt and all this, and that's all good. But I feel it's important personally to never forget really the impact that a symbol can have, and to maintain its meaning and to be vigilant in all areas for human rights. And I'm just going to tell you a little story about this flag. My sister lives in Kentucky. She had this flag outside of her house. And one day she received a note, a handwritten note. And you probably are thinking it was something really nasty. It was the opposite. Someone wrote her and said, I want to tell you how much I appreciate you putting this flag outside your house. Every day I walk past it, it means so much to me. So I got inspired and I put this flag outside of my house because I want to make sure that anyone driving by really gets a very clear message that he, she, or they are accepted by the larger community. That's just my small part, of course. So sometimes a symbol can really mean a lot to a person. I really would like to give a really, really, really big thank you to Savannah, our intern, because I think it's remarkable that she started her internship and I said, will you help me with this topic? And then she said, well, I'm studying gender studies. I said, really? And she jumped right in. We collaborated, we brainstormed, we shared agreements, disagreements, and it was really interesting. Different generational ideas came into play. Savannah, you did a great job. And I really appreciate everyone's comments and openness. I hope you enjoyed the talk. As usual, I hope that you want to learn more. So.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk, Joyce. This was really fantastic. And thank you guys all for coming.